What would you do if all the nannies ran away from your child's home one by one? This mother decided to find out the truth and set up a camera in the nursery, but what she saw in the footage made her heart sink. Like and subscribe to the channel. Where are you watching us from? Write in the comments. The night was heavy with the kind of stillness that only comes before a storm. Thick clouds blanketed the moon, casting the suburban street into a dim, oppressive darkness. The air smelled faintly of wet asphalt, and the occasional hiss of passing tires broke the uneasy silence. Liza sat slumped in the back seat of a taxi, her forehead resting against the cool glass of the window. The rhythmic hum of the engine and the soft murmur of the radio did little to soothe her. Her scrubs, once crisp and clean, now clung to her skin, wrinkled and damp with the sweat of a 12-hour shift in the emergency room. She was exhausted to the bone, but her mind buzzed with unease, refusing to let her drift into the mindless blur of fatigue. The screen of her phone, dimmed but still insistent, showed a missed call from Jasmine, her son's nanny. A cold knot twisted in Liza's stomach. It wasn't like Jasmine to call so late. Liza's thumb hovered over the call log, but something stopped her from dialing back. Not here. Not until she was home. The taxi rounded the corner onto her street. Rows of identical houses lined up in the gloom, their windows dark and silent, like closed eyes in sleep. Only her porch light was on, casting a pale, lonely pool of yellow onto the damp steps. The sight should have been comforting. Home, a sanctuary from the chaos of the hospital, but tonight it felt wrong. The car rolled to a stop. Liza paid the fare, murmured a quick thanks to the driver, and stepped out. The night air was cool against her flushed skin, but it brought no relief. Her heart quickened as she approached the front door. Through the frosted glass panel she saw a figure, Jasmine, standing stiffly in the entryway, a suitcase at her feet. Liza's hand, already on the door handle, faltered. She pushed the door open. The scent of lavender from the hallway diffuser mingled with something sharp and anxious, the unmistakable tension in the air before a confession. Jasmine's face was pale, her wide eyes shadowed by something more than exhaustion. Her hands, clenched around the handle of her suitcase, trembled slightly. "Liza," she said, her voice tight and thin. "I'm sorry. I can't stay here any longer." Liza's heart sank, dread blooming behind her ribs. She felt the heat of a dozen sleepless nights pressing down on her, the weight of too many goodbyes. "Jasmine," Liza said, her voice carefully measured against the panic rising in her throat. "What happened? Is Michael okay?" Jasmine nodded quickly, too quickly. "He's fine," she said, but her voice cracked on the word. "It's not him. It's something in his room. I can't explain it, but it's there. I feel it every night." The hallway felt colder. Liza's fingers tightened on the strap of her bag. "What do you mean, something?" Her voice, though calm, carried a hard edge. Jasmine hesitated, her eyes darting to the staircase as if expecting something to emerge from the shadows. "I hear things," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Little sounds, like scratching. And I see things. Toys moving, but not like a draft. Like something playing." Liza's rational mind snapped into place, clinging to logic like a lifeline. Old house, creaky pipes, drafts through the vents. She opened her mouth to say exactly that. But then Jasmine's voice, brittle with fear, cut through her defenses. "I've worked with children for years, Liza. I know what's real and what's not, but this feels wrong. I tried to ignore it, but every night, it's worse. And tonight, She broke off, her throat working against some unspoken horror. "I'm sorry," she said again, her voice cracking, "but I can't do this anymore. You're a good person. And Michael," her eyes softened briefly, filled with guilt. "He's such a sweet boy. But whatever is in that room, I can't face it again." Jasmine moved toward the door, dragging her suitcase behind her with a dull, final scrape. She paused, turning back with one last helpless glance. "I hope you find someone who can help you, but it won't be me." The door closed with a soft, resolute click, leaving Liza in a silence so heavy it seemed to press the air from her lungs. The house felt different without Jasmine. Colder, more hollow. Liza's eyes instinctively went to the stairs, to the darkened landing that led to Michael's room. Her son. She dropped her bag by the couch and climbed the steps, each creak beneath her bare feet a sharp reminder that the house was old, but not haunted. She wouldn't believe that. The door to Michael's room was ajar, a thin strip of warm nightlight spilling into the hall. She pushed it open softly. There he was, her boy, Michael, curled beneath his dinosaur-printed comforter, his dark curls a soft halo against the pillow. His little chest rose and fell in peaceful rhythm. The slow, steady sound of his breath was a balm against her shaken nerves. Liza stepped closer, brushing a hand through his curls. His skin was warm and safe. Her beautiful boy, but the room felt off. The air carried a faint chill that didn't belong in the coziness of his space. The shadows from the nightlight stretched oddly, too far, pooling in corners where they shouldn't reach. A whisper of instinct, ancient and primal, crawled up her spine. And then, Michael, still deep in sleep, shifted slightly. His lips moved, forming soft, dreamy words. He didn't mean to scare her. He just wants to play. Liza's breath caught, her heart a cold fist in her chest. "Who, baby?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. But Michael only sighed softly and turned, retreating deeper into the world of dreams. Liza stood in the doorway long after, her body a statue of indecision. She had never believed in ghosts and spirits or curses. She was a woman of science, of medicine, of cause and effect. But something was wrong in her son's room, something that sent seasoned caregivers fleeing in terror, and something that her little boy seemed to understand. As the night pressed close against the windows and the wind began to howl through the trees, Liza felt it, that she was no longer alone, not truly, and that this was only the beginning. The morning came gray and muted, the sky a dull sheet of slate as rain pattered softly against the windows. Liza sat at the kitchen table, her hands wrapped around a steaming mug of coffee that had long since gone cold. The events of the night before circled endlessly in her mind, a loop of confusion, fear, and unanswered questions. She had barely slept, the silence of the house pressing down on her as she lay awake, listening. But for what, she couldn't say. Her gaze drifted toward the staircase, toward Michael's room above. The house was still, peaceful, but the echoes of Jasmine's words lingered, heavy with something she couldn't dismiss. She needed answers, not guesses, not fears. Cold, solid answers. Liza was not a woman to be swayed by whispers or shadows. The hospital taught her that, where life and death were measured in hard numbers and precise actions. If something was happening in Michael's room, it would leave traces, evidence, and she would find it. By mid-morning, she had the camera. A sleek, unobtrusive model she picked up at the electronics store, one designed for nurseries and pet monitoring. High resolution, night vision, motion detection. It would capture everything. She spent nearly an hour installing it, placing it carefully on the bookshelf, angled perfectly to cover the entire room: the bed, the toy chest, the windows, and the closet. She connected it to her phone and laptop, ensuring she could monitor it live and review recordings. Michael watched her curiously from the carpet where he sat playing with his toy dinosaurs. His little brow furrowed, and he paused, holding a green T-Rex in his small hand. "Is that for my friend?" he asked softly. Liza froze for a second, her fingers tightening on the camera's casing. She forced her voice to remain steady, casual. "No, sweetheart. It's just to help Mommy see you while I'm at work, so I know you're safe." Michael seemed to consider this. "But he's nice. He wouldn't hurt me." Liza felt the hair on the back of her neck rise, a cold ripple over her skin. "Who, baby?" she asked carefully. But Michael only smiled a little, as though sharing a secret, and turned back to his dinosaurs without answering. The day passed without incident. No noises, no sudden chills. Only the occasional beep from her phone, notifying her that the camera had detected movement, usually just Michael wandering through the room. By the time night fell, the house seemed to settle into its usual rhythm, and a part of her began to hope that perhaps Jasmine's nerves had simply gotten the better of her. But the knot in her chest refused to loosen. That night, after tucking Michael into bed and reading him his favorite story, she returned to her own room. She sat cross-legged on the bed, laptop open, and watched the live feed from the camera. The room on the screen was bathed in the soft, golden glow of the nightlight. The shadows pooled gently in the corners, and the small form of her son lay still beneath his dinosaur quilt. Peaceful, safe. Liza kept watching. Minutes became hours, the silence broken only by the occasional whisper of static from the speakers. Midnight came and went. Her eyes burned from the screen's glow, and fatigue weighed heavy on her limbs. She considered shutting the laptop and going to sleep. Everything seemed normal. But then, it started. First, the smallest thing, a flicker. The faintest ripple in the air near the toy chest, barely visible on the camera. She leaned closer, her heart skipping. It could be dust, she told herself, or a trick of the lens. But the motion detector chimed, confirming that something had moved. The tiny red ball, a toy Michael often tossed around, shifted. Slowly, deliberately. It rolled away from the chest, then stopped abruptly, as if it had been nudged. Liza's pulse quickened, and her breath shallowed. She stared, unmoving, her logical mind scrambling for an answer. Vibration from a truck passing outside? But no, she felt nothing. The house was still, completely still. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard as if she could somehow control the scene unfolding. She pressed the rewind, then played it again. The ball rolled, no strings, no push from Michael, who remained deeply asleep. Then the closet door. It was closed, but the edges seemed wrong, not solid, as if the shadows behind it were darker than they should be, shifting against the grain of logic. Liza's hand trembled slightly as she clicked to zoom in. The pixels blurred briefly, then sharpened. A shape. Something low to the ground, like the suggestion of movement. Too quick to be defined, but there. She felt her mouth go dry. A sudden burst of static hissed through the speakers, sharp and jarring. She flinched, and the screen went black for half a second, then returned. But the scene had changed. The closet door was open, wide. Her heart slammed against her ribs as she stared, frozen. She hadn't heard it creak open, but there it was. The inside of the closet was a yawning void, the light from the room failing to reach its back. It was just shadows. only shadows. Then, from the monitor, a whisper, soft, barely audible. The hairs on her arms stood up, every nerve tightening as her ears strained to catch the faint, disembodied sound. A child's laugh, light, playful, and not Michael's. The camera feed jumped, a sudden blur like something darting fast across the lens. Liza's hand flew to her mouth, a sharp gasp choking behind her fingers. When the image cleared, the room was still. Michael, untouched, lay peacefully beneath his covers. The closet stood open, hollow and empty. The ball rested in the center of the floor. The nightlight flickered once, then steadied. The timestamp on the recording read 3:12 a.m. Her heart hammered, but her hands were steady as she rewound and played the clip again. And again. Looking for a flaw, a trick. But there was none. The camera had seen what it had seen. There was no glitch, no prank. Just a truth she didn't want to face. The whisper, the shadow, the door. A cold dread settled into her bones, the kind that no amount of logic could shake. The room beyond her own was silent, but somehow it felt watchful, like it knew she was watching back. Liza snapped the laptop shut, her reflection briefly flashing across the dark screen. Pale, wide-eyed, and deeply, deeply afraid. In the heavy stillness, she heard it, faint and distant from the baby monitor, soft, playful, the voice of her son murmuring in his sleep. He says he's sorry. He didn't mean to scare you. Liza's blood ran cold, because Michael was alone. Wasn't he? The morning brought no comfort. The sun broke weakly through a curtain of clouds, casting the room in a pale, anemic light. Liza sat at the kitchen counter, her eyes burning from a night without sleep. The events captured by the camera replayed relentlessly in her mind. She had watched the recording over and over, scouring every frame for something, anything, that could explain what she had seen. But there were no tricks, no malfunctions. The ball had moved, the closet had opened, and there had been a whisper, a child's laugh that did not belong to her son. Her fingers, cold and tense, circled the mug of coffee she had barely touched. The surface had long gone cold, but she couldn't bring herself to move, to eat, to do anything but replay every second of the night in her head. Was it a draft? A reflection from the streetlights outside? Or something else? Something she couldn't rationalize? And Michael, he had spoken, in his sleep. He had said, "He didn't mean to scare you." Her son knew something she did not. The sound of small feet padding into the kitchen broke through her spiraling thoughts. She looked up to see Michael, his curls tousled from sleep, his dinosaur pajamas slightly rumpled. His eyes, warm and bright, met hers with a simple, innocent smile. It was a look that should have eased her heart. Instead, it made her chest tighten. "Good morning, baby," she managed, her voice softer than she intended. "Did you sleep well?" Michael nodded, climbing into his chair. "Uh-huh. He didn't come last night. I think he was shy because you were watching." Liza felt the air leave her lungs in a tight, sudden exhale. She gripped the edge of the counter, her knuckles whitening. "Who, sweetie?" she asked carefully, her voice calm, though every muscle in her body tensed with dread. Michael's little shoulders lifted in a shrug. "My friend. He likes my toys. He's funny, but he gets sad sometimes." The room felt colder, as if the air itself had turned heavier, pressing against her skin. She forced a smile she did not feel. "Does your friend have a name?" Michael paused, tilting his head as if listening to something she couldn't hear. Then he shook his head. "No, but he says he was here before. Liza's heart thudded painfully against her ribs. Before. The word hung in the air, heavy and wrong. She felt the questions clawing up her throat. Who was he? What did he want? But she swallowed them down. Michael was only a child. She didn't want to scare him, but she was scared, more than she could admit. That day at work, her exhaustion was absolute, but the memories clung to her like a second skin. The hospital, usually a place of clarity and control, felt distant. The bright white lights and the constant buzz of machinery couldn't shake the cold weight in her chest. Between rounds, she found herself scrolling through the footage on her phone, pausing and replaying the moments over and over, looking for some detail she had missed. But there was nothing new. The truth was there, raw and unexplainable. During a coffee break, she mentioned it, casually, she told herself, to her colleague, Dr. Nathan Reed. Nathan was a friend, one of the few people she trusted outside her family. He was a pragmatist, sharp and skeptical. She thought he'd help her untangle the knots of her fear. "So," Nathan said, stirring his coffee lazily, "you're telling me toys moving on their own, doors opening, and your kid talking to something that isn't there?" Liza pressed her fingers against her temples. "I know how it sounds." Nathan leaned back, folding his arms, his expression both curious and cautious. "You're not sleeping. Night shifts are murder on your head. You sure you're not projecting? Kids say weird stuff all the time. Imaginary friends, classic coping mechanism. You told me he's been lonely since—" "I know my son," Liza cut in, her voice tight. "And I know what I saw. The camera doesn't hallucinate." Nathan frowned, but there was something softer in his eyes now. "All right," he said after a pause. "Look, it's an old house. Could be anything. Settling floors, drafts through old vents, or—" He smirked slightly, trying to lighten the mood. "Maybe you got yourself a ghost." Liza shot him a withering look. Very helpful. But Nathan's smirk faded into something more thoughtful. "I know a guy," he said finally. He's not a plumber, if you get what I mean. More like a specialist. He looks into weird stuff. Might help you figure out what's going on." Liza shook her head immediately. "I'm not calling a ghost hunter." "Why not?" "Because," she said, her voice sharp with frustration, "I believe in answers. Real ones. Not fairy tales." Nathan held up his hands. "Fair enough, but if this keeps up, you might want to keep an open mind." Liza's answer was a long, strained silence. When she returned home, dusk was already creeping across the sky. The house stood quietly under the dimming light, the windows reflecting only the graying sky. Inside, everything felt still, but the silence was not comforting. It was weighted, waiting. That night, she stayed with Michael again. She didn't tell him why. She simply brought a book and read to him until his eyelids fluttered and his breathing slowed into sleep. Then she waited. The clock ticked, loud and insistent. The shadows pooled thickly in the corners of the room, stretching beyond the reach of the nightlight's amber glow. The air felt different, heavier, like the room was holding its breath. Her eyes flicked to the closet, closed. She could see the seam of the door from where she sat, a perfect line cutting through the dark wood. It did not move, but the air was wrong. The scent of the room, a familiar mix of baby powder and fabric softener, was touched by something else. Something faint and cold, like the smell of earth after rain, or something older, forgotten. A soft sound broke the silence, a gentle scrape, faint and rhythmic. Liza's breath hitched. She turned her head slowly, her ears straining to catch it. The sound so delicate it could have been mistaken for the settling of the old house, seemed to come from behind the wall. No, from within it. A chill slid down her spine, her pulse quickening. She stared at the wall, at the smooth, painted surface, her mind racing. The sound came again, a soft, dragging shuffle, like something brushing against the inside of the wall itself. And then, a whisper, so faint, so fragile it could have been her own breath catching in her throat, but it wasn't. The whisper came from the wall. Her heart thudded, her body frozen in the instinctive paralysis that comes when something defies the rules of the world you know. But then Michael stirred, a small soft sound escaping him as he shifted under his covers. Liza moved. Swift and silent, she crossed the room and lowered herself beside him, her hand pressed gently to his back, feeling the steady rise and fall of his breaths. Warm, safe. But the whispering did not stop. It was closer now, so close it felt like it was threading through the air around them. And then, just as suddenly as it began, it stopped. The room plunged into a silence so complete it rang in her ears. Her heart pounded, and her breath came shallow and fast, but the air was still. The wall was still. Liza's hand shook as she brushed a curl from Michael's forehead. He did not wake. His sleep was deep and peaceful, but hers would not be, because something was in this house. And it was getting closer. The night pressed heavily against the windows, the world outside reduced to shadows, and a distant hush of wind through the trees. Inside the house, every sound seemed magnified. The tick of the clock on the hallway wall, the faint groan of settling wood, and the slow, steady breath of her sleeping son. Liza sat in the armchair beside Michael's bed, wrapped in a soft throw blanket, her eyes fixed on the gentle rise and fall of his chest. The baby monitor on the nightstand flickered with a steady green light, casting a faint glow across the room. She had made her decision. No more watching from a screen. No more distance. If something was happening here, if something was in here with them, then she would face it herself. She needed to see it, feel it, understand it. The camera on the shelf blinked its red recording light, silently capturing everything. But this time she wasn't relying on the lens. She was here. The nightlight painted the room in a soft amber haze, casting long, languid shadows across the walls. The familiar shapes of dinosaurs, toys, and books stood as silent sentinels in the half-light. But Liza felt the wrongness, that thin, invisible tension that turned ordinary darkness into something expectant. The air felt thick, charged with something unseen but undeniable. Minutes stretched into an hour, then 2. The house remained unnervingly still. No whispers, no creaks, no flickers from the closet door. Liza's eyes began to burn from the strain of keeping them open, her body heavy with exhaustion. The fatigue of days spent working, worrying, and watching pressed down on her like a leaden weight. But she fought it, forcing her gaze to stay sharp, her ears attuned to every tiny sound. The clock on her phone showed 12:47 a.m. Her eyelids fluttered. She blinked hard, straightened up, and rubbed her face, the cool air against her skin sharp enough to stave off sleep. For now. And then, the book fell. A sudden, sharp thump broke the silence as a small hardcover tumbled from the shelf. The noise, abrupt and intrusive, sliced through the quiet like a blade. Liza's heart leapt, her body tensing instantly. Her eyes snapped to the floor where the book lay, its pages splayed like broken wings. She hadn't moved. Nothing had touched it. Yet there it was. Her breath quickened, the pulse pounding in her ears. She looked toward Michael, still asleep, undisturbed. Slowly she stood, every muscle in her body tight and coiled, and approached the fallen book. She bent down, fingers brushing its worn cover. It was The Little Dinosaur Adventure, one of Michael's favorites. She placed it back on the shelf with a careful precision. The air around her felt charged, the kind of static tension that makes the hair on your arms rise, that unseen pressure before a storm. She felt it prickling over her skin, cold and electric. Then, from the other side of the room, a soft thud. Liza's head snapped towards the sound. A small rubber ball, bright red and worn with play, rolled lazily across the carpet from the direction of the toy chest. It moved slowly, without urgency, coming to rest by her foot. Her voice came, tight and low, barely more than a whisper. "Michael?" But her son was asleep. His small form was still, his breath soft and even. She felt her stomach knot. The air shifted, subtle but undeniable. The warmth of the room bled away, leaving behind a sudden, unnatural chill. And then, soft and fleeting, a sound, like a breath, a whisper that barely existed, brushing against the edge of hearing. She turned her head sharply, her ears straining, but the room remained silent. The whisper was gone, or perhaps it had never been. The closet. Her eyes fell to it, the dark, unmoving shape against the far wall. It was closed, the line of the door stark and straight, but it felt wrong, like it was watching. A presence without eyes. A cold certainty settled in her chest. The closet. She needed to know. Her steps were slow, the carpet swallowing the soft pads of her bare feet. The nightlight's glow waned here, shadows thickening as she approached the door. Her fingers hovered over the handle, cool and smooth beneath her touch. Her breath shallowed, her pulse loud in her ears. Her heart screamed at her to stop, but her hand turned the knob. The door opened with a low, drawn-out creak. The space beyond was pitch dark, too dark. The closet felt deeper than it should be, the shadows within thick and impenetrable. Her phone's flashlight broke the darkness with a harsh, cold beam, slicing through the gloom to reveal nothing. Just the usual. A row of Michael's tiny shirts, colorful and neatly hung, a basket of toys, and the carpeted floor, but the air in there felt colder, staler. It smelled faintly of earth, of something old and undisturbed. She let out a slow, shaky breath. "Nothing," she whispered, the word meant to calm herself, though it didn't. A click. The light on her phone flickered. Then, a soft patter, barely audible, behind her. She spun, her heart thundering. The toy shelf. A small plastic dinosaur tipped forward, teetered, and fell with a clatter. Her mouth went dry. Something was moving through the room. She felt it, a presence shifting, unseen but unmistakable. The air felt alive, humming with something that should not be. And then, Michael stirred, his small voice thick with sleep and something else, something distant, rose softly in the charged air. "He's here," he murmured. "He wants to play." The light from the nightlight pulsed, dimmed, and from somewhere, a small, muffled laugh, soft, playful, and utterly wrong. Liza's body reacted before her mind. She was at the bedside in a heartbeat, scooping Michael into her arms, his warmth and softness grounding her against the rising tide of terror. His head rested against her shoulder, his breath steady and unaware. The closet door, still open, gave a low, hollow creak. Her eyes locked on it, and something moved. Not a shape, not a figure, but a shadow. Too fast, too fluid, a darkness that slipped from the closet and dissolved into the wall beyond. Gone, but not gone. Her heart pounded so hard it felt like it would burst. The room, silent once more. The toy, the book, the ball, all still. She felt Michael's small fingers curl into her sleeve. His voice, soft against her ear, whispered, "He's sad, Mommy. He misses his home." Liza's arms tightened around him. Her throat was tight, and every nerve in her body screamed to run, to leave this room, this house, this thing. But she didn't, because the only thing stronger than her fear was her need to protect her son. Her voice, shaken but firm, broke the silence. "I don't care who you are," she whispered, her voice low and fierce. "You will not hurt him." The room answered with a silence so thick it felt like it was listening. And somewhere, deep within that silence, it felt like something listened back. But it did not leave. It was waiting. And so was she. The morning arrived pale and muted, the world outside veiled in a gray haze. Liza sat on the edge of her bed, her body aching from a night spent cradling Michael in the armchair until the first hints of dawn crept through the curtains. She had not slept. Not truly. The tension in her muscles was a wire pulled too tight, ready to snap. But what haunted her more than the shadows and the sounds was Michael's soft whisper, "He's sad, Mommy. He misses his home." The words gnawed at her, hollowing her from the inside. Who was he? And what home did he mean? She knew now there was something real here, something beyond creaks and drafts, something that lived within the bones of this house. And she could no longer stand to be in the dark. She had to find the truth. After breakfast, Liza kept Michael close, distracting him with his cartoons while her mind churned. She tried to decide where to start. The camera had shown her the surface, the moving toys, the creeping shadows. But the sounds, the whispers, the scratches, they came from within, from behind the walls. She remembered the cold draft she'd felt in his room, the whispering that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. Her mind latched onto it, the wall. That was where the house was hiding its secrets. When Michael drifted into his afternoon nap, his tiny form tucked safely into her bed, she returned to his room. It felt different now, charged, like it was watching her move. But she wouldn't let herself be intimidated. She had fought death on too many hospital shifts to cower from shadows. Her fingers skimmed along the wall by the bookshelf, pressing lightly as if the house itself might respond. She felt it again, that subtle thread of cold air, faint but steady. It leaked through a hairline crack barely visible beneath the dinosaur-patterned wallpaper. Liza's heart quickened. There was something. She hurried to the garage and returned with a utility knife. The room seemed to know what she intended. The air grew still, heavy with an almost expectant silence. The wallpaper tore easily, curling back from the blade to reveal the drywall beneath. She worked methodically, stripping a section large enough to expose the surface fully. Her breath hitched. There, almost perfectly hidden in the drywall, was a small, uneven patch of plaster, a covering, a seal. Liza's skin prickled. Someone had closed something up, deliberately. She grabbed the hammer. Each strike against the plaster felt like breaking open a coffin. Dust puffed from the cracks as the old material gave way, flaking and crumbling under her blows. The sound of each hit echoed strangely in the small room, too loud, too hollow, as if the wall were a shell over something vast and unseen. The last piece of plaster fell away, and behind it, a dark, narrow opening. Liza froze, the breath torn from her lungs. It wasn't a crawl space, it wasn't a part of the closet or an old vent. It was a hole, a space within the wall, untouched and unknown. The scent hit her immediately, earthy, damp, and ancient, as though the air from within had been trapped for decades. Her stomach twisted at the wrongness of it. She lifted her phone, turning on the flashlight and angling it inside. The beam sliced through the dark, illuminating rough wooden beams and claw marks. Long, jagged scrapes gouged into the wood from within. Her heart pounded painfully. Something had been in there, and it had tried to get out. The air shifted. She felt it, cold and almost curious. She fought the instinct to step back. She would not be afraid. Then, from the blackness of the hole, movement. She gasped, the phone shaking in her hand as two small, glinting eyes reflected back at her. She stumbled backward, her heart in her throat, but the thing didn't lunge, didn't snarl. It simply watched. And in the next instant, it emerged, small, trembling, and frail. A baby raccoon. The tiny creature, thin and dusty, its fur patchy and matted, sniffed at the air with a soft, high-pitched whimper. Its left front paw dragged limply against the floor, clearly injured. Liza's chest heaved with the adrenaline still flooding her veins, but the terror cracked, splintering under something warmer. Pity. She lowered herself slowly to her knees, her voice soft, unsure. "Hey there. What are you doing in here, little guy?" The raccoon flinched but didn't retreat, its black eyes wide and frightened. Liza's hands, still trembling from the fear that had gripped her moments before, softened into something else. Care. She backed up slowly, not to frighten the creature, and grabbed an empty laundry basket. She lined it with a soft towel from the dresser. "It's okay," she whispered, inching the basket forward. "I won't hurt you. Let's get you some help." The raccoon hesitated, its little body tense with fear and pain. But something, maybe instinct, maybe exhaustion, overcame it. With a feeble stumble, it dragged itself into the towel-lined basket, curling up in a shaken, pitiful ball. Liza felt her chest tighten. "Poor thing," she murmured, her voice thick with sudden emotion. How long had it been trapped? How had it survived? A voice broke her thoughts. Soft, gentle. "He's the one." She turned sharply. Michael stood in the doorway, his eyes wide with wonder, his voice dreamlike. "Michael," she gasped, "I thought you were asleep." But he only stared into the basket, his expression not of surprise, but of recognition. "He's my friend," Michael said softly, his tiny voice filled with something like relief. He was stuck. Liza's blood ran cold. She felt the questions rise like a flood. How did he know? What had he been seeing? Hearing? But Michael spoke again, his voice small and simple. He didn't mean to scare the nannies, Mommy. He was just lonely. The floor seemed to shift beneath her. All this time, the toys, the sounds, the whispers. It hadn't been malice. It had been pleas. The little raccoon, now curled tight and trembling in its basket, gave the smallest, softest sound, a whimper, almost like a sigh, and the air in the room changed. The heaviness, the cold edge that had clung to every corner, it lifted, as though something unseen had been holding its breath, and finally exhaled. The house felt different. The oppressive weight that had seeped into every corner of Michael's room seemed to have eased, though the air remained charged with something unfinished, an expectant quiet, as if the house itself waited to see what Liza would do next. She knelt beside the laundry basket, where the tiny raccoon lay curled in the folds of the towel, its small sides rising and falling with shallow breaths. Its injured paw, bent at an unnatural angle, made Liza's chest ache with sympathy. Michael stood beside her, his wide eyes fixed on the little creature. His small hand hovered uncertainly above it, as though wanting to comfort it, but afraid to cause harm. "Is he going to be okay, Mommy?" His voice was soft, almost pleading. Liza felt the thousand answers that could come, some easy, some cruel, but she met his gaze and chose honesty. "I don't know, baby, but we're going to help him, I promise." The raccoon gave a faint, breathy sound, half a whimper, half a sigh. Its small, black eyes, glazed with pain, met Liza's for the briefest second, and in that fragile moment, something passed between them. It wasn't human, it wasn't language, but it was real. She felt it, a sadness, but also trust, a yielding. Liza stood, the decision already made. "We're taking him somewhere he can get help." Michael's little face brightened with hope. "Not the pound, right, Mommy? They hurt animals." "No," she said firmly, "somewhere safe." The drive to the Wildlife Rehabilitation Center was silent but tense. Michael held the basket carefully on his lap, his small hands gripping the edges as though his very touch could shield the creature inside. Liza could see him glancing down every few seconds, whispering soft assurances only a child could give. "It's okay, little guy. You'll be okay. Mommy's a doctor. She helps people. She'll help you, too." The center stood at the edge of the woods, a low building with the comforting look of a place that had seen many lives pass through its doors, some saved, some lost. The receptionist, a woman with a warm smile and kind eyes, greeted them softly, but quickly sobered at the sight of the small, trembling form in the basket. Within minutes, the raccoon was whisked into the back for treatment, leaving Michael clutching Liza's hand and staring at the doors through which his friend had disappeared. "Will they make him better?" he asked, his voice small. "They'll do their best," Liza said, kneeling to his level. "And if he can't live in the wild, they'll find him a place where he's safe and cared for." Michael's lip trembled, but he nodded. I want him to be happy." Liza pulled him into a gentle hug. "Me too, baby." The next few days felt different. The house seemed lighter, as though a long-held breath had finally been released. The nights passed without incident. No whispers, no creaks, no sudden chills. And Michael slept soundly, his dreams peaceful and uninterrupted. But Liza felt something unfinished, a thread still tugging at the edge of her thoughts. She found herself pausing outside Michael's room more than once, listening, not for danger, but for something else. And in those moments, she felt watched. But it wasn't the cold, prying gaze that had haunted her before. This was gentle, patient, waiting for something. Then the call came. The woman from the Wildlife Center spoke with a soft, careful tone, but Liza heard the relief behind it. The raccoon had survived surgery. His paw was mending. He was weak but improving. They believed in time he could be returned to the wild. "He was very lucky you brought him in when you did," the woman said. "You saved him." When Liza told Michael, his whole face lit up with joy. "He's going to be okay," he shouted, spinning in a circle. Then, suddenly serious, he looked at her and said, "Can we say goodbye to him before he goes?" The request pulled at Liza's heart. "I'll call them," she promised. The following afternoon, they visited the center. Michael approached the small enclosure where the raccoon rested, his paw bandaged but his eyes brighter now. The little creature lifted its head, nose twitching as it seemed to recognize them. Michael placed his hand gently on the glass. "Hi, little guy," he whispered. "I'm so happy you're better. I'm sorry you got stuck in our house, but thank you for playing with me." The raccoon's ears flicked. For a second, it pressed its tiny paw to the glass, mirroring Michael's hand with a touch as soft as memory. And in that fragile, perfect moment, something passed. A farewell, an understanding. When they returned home, the house felt complete. The walls, the floors, the very air seemed to hum with something that had been broken and was now whole. And that night, as Liza tucked Michael into bed, he smiled sleepily and said, "He's happy now, Mommy. He found his way home." Liza smoothed his curls, her heart full and aching. "Yes, baby. He did." She turned off the light, but before she closed the door, she paused, her breath catching. On the windowsill, in the soft silver of the moonlight, lay a small, perfect acorn. Liza's throat tightened, her eyes burning with sudden, overwhelming emotion. Because somehow she knew it was a thank you. The house felt different now, not just lighter, but alive in a way it hadn't before. The oppressive coldness that had seeped into every corner was gone, replaced by a warmth that felt like sunlight, even on the cloudiest days. The walls no longer creaked with unseen weight, and the air no longer carried the whispers of something forgotten. It felt as if the house itself had been holding its breath for so long, and at last it had exhaled. Liza felt it most clearly in Michael's room. The shadows were just shadows now, simple and honest, stretching with the slow dance of the sun through the windows. The nightlight no longer flickered uncertainly, and the toys stayed where they belonged unless Michael moved them. The difference was subtle, but it was there, and it felt like home. For the first time in months, Liza allowed herself to sleep without the restless coil of dread in her chest. The baby monitor beside her bed, which had once been a source of fear, now brought her comfort. The soft rhythm of Michael's breath a lullaby in the quiet. She slept deeply, dreamlessly, and when she woke it was to the gentle warmth of morning and the faint sound of Michael's laughter from his room. Liza stood in the doorway, unseen, and watched her son playing, his dinosaurs parading across the carpet in a colorful line. His little voice narrated their journey, over mountains made of pillows, through valleys carved by blankets. He was happy, truly, fully happy, and there was something in his eyes that hadn't been there before. Ease. He was no longer waiting for something in the corners, no longer listening for something behind the walls. The doorbell rang unexpectedly, breaking the warm spell of the morning. Liza glanced down the hallway, her brows lifting in curiosity. She wasn't expecting anyone. When she opened the door, a woman stood there, a soft, welcoming smile on her face. She looked to be in her mid-30s, with warm brown eyes and a calmness that seemed to radiate from her. She carried a small bag slung over one shoulder and held a neatly folded file in her hands. "Hi," the woman said, her voice bright but gentle. "I'm Vanessa, from Bright Path Nannies. I believe you reached out about a new caregiver?" Liza felt a small flicker of surprise, but nodded. "Oh, yes, I sent the request a couple of weeks ago, but I wasn't expecting anyone so soon." Vanessa smiled warmly. "We had a cancellation and your profile matched perfectly. If it's a good time, I'd love to meet you and Michael." Liza felt an instinctive hesitation. The last 5 nannies had all ended the same way. Fear, sudden departures. But she shook the thought aside. That's over now. It's different. She stepped back and opened the door. "Of course. Please, come in." Michael peeked curiously from behind the living room couch, his dinosaur clutched in one hand. His eyes were wide, but there was no fear, only curiosity. Liza smiled. "Michael, this is Vanessa. She's here to meet you." Vanessa crouched down, her eyes level with his. "Hi, Michael. I love your dinosaur. What's his name?" Michael hesitated only a moment before answering proudly, "This is Spike. He's the leader of the dinosaur family." Vanessa's eyes lit up with genuine delight. "Spike! That's a strong name. I bet he's very brave." Michael's smile widened, and Liza felt her heart ease. Vanessa wasn't pushing, wasn't rushing. She was listening, and Michael was responding. The two spent the next half hour together while Liza watched from the kitchen. Vanessa followed Michael's lead, asking about his toys, joining his games without overpowering them. There was laughter, easy, joyful laughter, and Liza felt a knot in her chest loosen that she hadn't realized she was still holding. After Michael scampered off to show Vanessa another toy, Liza approached her, her voice soft but certain. "You're wonderful with him." Vanessa smiled. "Thank you. He's a special kid. I can see that right away." She hesitated, her expression shifting into something more serious but still kind. "I read in your profile about some difficulties with previous caregivers. I know it's not easy to trust someone new, especially after unsettling experiences." Liza felt the weight of all those months press briefly against her chest, but then release. "We had some strange things happen," she admitted softly, "but it's better now. The house, it feels different." Vanessa nodded, her expression open and understanding. "Sometimes places hold things, and sometimes they let them go when they're ready." Liza's breath caught for a moment. There was something in the way Vanessa said it, something that felt true. But the warmth in Vanessa's eyes was steady, grounding. "I'd like to be here for him," she said simply, "if you'll let me." Liza looked over to where Michael was lining up his dinosaurs again, his small face alight with joy. The air felt clear, the shadows were still, and something deep inside her, something instinctual, told her what to say. "Yes," she said, her voice soft but firm. "Let's try." The rest of the day was easy, filled with laughter and stories, and by the time evening fell, Michael was already asking if Vanessa would come back tomorrow. Liza promised him she would, and for the first time in months, she promised it with certainty. That night, as she tucked Michael into bed, he looked up at her with that soft, knowing smile that always seemed to hold more than his small years should. "He's happy now, Mommy," he said sleepily, his voice fading as his eyes began to close. He said, "Thank you." Liza froze, her heart stopping for a breath. "Who, baby?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. But Michael was already asleep, his little hand resting on Spike the dinosaur, his breathing slow and peaceful. Liza sat with him for a moment longer, brushing a stray curl from his forehead. Then she rose and turned to leave the room. But before she did, her eyes flicked to the windowsill. The acorn was still there, where it had been since they returned from the wildlife center. But something was different. Beside it, nestled gently against the glass, was a single, tiny feather. Liza's breath caught, a warmth unfurling in her chest, a warmth not of heat, but of knowing. The house was quiet, truly, deeply quiet, but it was not empty. It was grateful, and so was she. The morning arrived with a soft golden glow, sunlight spilling through the windows and painting the walls in warmth. The air felt crisp and clean, as though the house itself had been swept free of every shadow. For the first time in months, Liza awoke without the familiar weight of dread in her chest. No tension, no unease, only the soft sounds of the world waking up and the faint hum of life through the walls. She stretched beneath the covers, her body still heavy with sleep, but her heart strangely light. The monitor on her nightstand played the soft, steady rhythm of Michael's breathing from his room, and her lips curved into a smile. She could feel it without seeing him. He was safe. The house, once cold and watchful, now felt like it was holding them, warm and protective. The sound of small feet padding down the hallway broke the silence, and a moment later, Michael appeared in her doorway, his hair tousled from sleep and his dinosaur clutched under one arm. "Good morning, Mommy," he said, his voice soft and sweet. Liza opened her arms, and he climbed into the bed beside her, curling into her warmth. She pressed a kiss to his curls, breathing in his familiar scent. "Good morning, baby. Did you sleep well?" His little head nodded against her chest. "Yeah, no more noises, no more shadows." He's happy now. So I'm happy too. Liza felt a soft ache bloom in her chest, tender and warm. She still didn't fully understand what had happened, how a presence, unseen and unknown, had moved through their lives, leaving behind fear and confusion, only to vanish with a simple act of kindness. But maybe she didn't need to understand. Maybe some things didn't live in the space of reason, but in the folds of the heart. The day unfolded gently. Michael played with his dinosaurs in the living room, his little voice filling the air with stories of brave T-Rexes and daring Triceratops adventures. Vanessa arrived shortly after breakfast, her easy smile and calm presence settling into the house as naturally as sunlight. She and Michael built towers from blocks, raced toy cars, and shared laughter that felt like it had always belonged here. Liza watched them from the kitchen, the warmth of her coffee cup against her palms mirrored in her chest. By the afternoon, the sky was bright and clear, and Liza suggested they play outside. The autumn air was crisp but inviting, and the leaves had begun their slow turn to amber and gold. Michael raced ahead with his plastic dinosaurs clutched in both hands, his laughter ringing out across the small backyard. Vanessa followed, joining his imaginary battles with playful roars and dramatic defeats. Liza felt a peace so profound it made her pause, standing on the porch as the sunlight kissed her skin. The house behind her, the laughter before her, this was what she had fought for. Not just safety, but wholeness. Not just an end to fear, but the return of joy. Her eyes drifted to the towering oak tree that stood proudly in the yard, its branches stretching toward the sky. Something small caught her eye, a flash of color among the roots. Curious, she crossed the grass and knelt down, brushing aside a few fallen leaves. There, nestled against the tree's gnarled roots, lay something unexpected. A small cluster of acorns, carefully arranged in a neat circle. And, resting in the center, delicate and white, was a tiny feather. A soft breath escaped her lips, and for a moment, the world seemed to still. The wind stirred through the leaves, whispering softly against her skin. She felt it, a presence, warm and gentle, not watching her but with her. There was no fear, no chill, only something that felt like gratitude. Her throat tightened, and her fingers brushed the tiny offering with reverence. It was small, simple, just acorns and a feather, but she knew. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice soft and full, carried away on the breeze. The wind curled around her, playful and warm, and for just a heartbeat she felt it, an answer. Not in words, but in something deeper. Goodbye, and thank you. Liza's eyes stung, but she smiled, a true, wide smile that reached her soul. She rose, brushing her hands on her jeans, and turned back to where Vanessa and Michael played, their laughter a bright, living thing that filled the air.